Thanks, Irene. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Really excited to be here with you all. My name's Scott Rodilitz. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at the Yale School of Management. I'm going to be presenting on some joint work with Vahideh Manshadi on online policies for efficient volunteer crowdsourcing. Now, our work can be applied broadly to volunteer-based platforms, as well as a few other applications, which I'll mention at the end of the presentation. But for the focus of this talk, I'm going to be spending some time on our motivating application of food recovery. So, why is food recovery important? Well, in the US, we waste a ton of food. In fact, we waste 60 million tons of food each year. And simultaneously, there's 37 million Americans, including 11 million children that live in food insecure households. Now, it seems like there's a simple solution here. You want to take the food from where it's wasted and deliver it to the people who need it. But unfortunately, this can be challenging for a few reasons. First, it's hard to make those connections between potential donors and potential recipients. And second, that transportation can often be costly, particularly the last mile transportation. Luckily, we live in a world in which online platforms have stepped in to try to solve a number of societal problems. And this one is no different. There's a lot of platforms that are working on this. I won't go into details about many of them. Suffice it to say that they frequently use volunteers to facilitate this last mile transportation. Now, I will talk to you about one of these in particular, Food Rescue US, which we've been collaborating with for the past few years. Now, at a high level, Food Rescue US has had a pretty significant top-line impact. They're active in over 10 states, and I want to emphasize that they have an active base of over 5,000 volunteers. Now, the way they work on a local level, in each city in which they're active, there's a site director. This site director is responsible for making connections between donors and recipients and creating a schedule of donations. They post this schedule to their website and app, and volunteers sign up. However, sometimes a rescue approaches and no volunteer is signed up. And in that case, site directors turn to nudging mechanisms to try to encourage volunteers to sign up for a particular rescue. This leads to our research question that we're going to be talking about today, which is how can we efficiently nudge volunteers to minimize the number of missed donations? Okay, so when we're thinking about notifying volunteers, there's a few things we need to keep in mind. The first is that our notifications need to be infrequent. I'm sure you've all downloaded an app that immediately inundated you with notifications. You probably quickly silenced those notifications or even deleted the app. Now, we want to avoid that. In addition, we can't require a quick response or even a response at all from these volunteers. They're not employees. We can't treat them like they are. And so with these considerations in mind, which we got from talking to site directors and are consistent with the literature on volunteer management, such as avoiding notification fatigue and overutilization, we have this framework within which we need to operate that's somewhat challenging. And to show you the challenge, let's look at a toy example. So suppose we can notify each volunteer every 2 days, and we have a donation that's available today. Now we can choose, we have 2 volunteers to choose from, and we can choose to notify none of these volunteers. We can choose to notify one of them. We can choose to notify both. Because we can't require a quick response, sequential notification is just not practical. And so we need to make a one-time decision. So suppose we notify both volunteers. Well, as long as one of them responds positively, this donation gets completed. However, because we notified both of them, if a donation arrives tomorrow, we can't notify either volunteer, and this donation goes unfulfilled. And this is a somewhat classic OR trade-off between the value that we get from today, which can be maximized by notifying more volunteers, versus the future value that we can get, which would be maximized by saving volunteers for that future date. Now, I want to remark that current Food Rescue US practice is to notify volunteers at most once per week, and site directors currently spend a fair amount of time deciding in an ad hoc basis which volunteers to notify. They choose somewhat randomly a small subset of volunteers whom they haven't notified in the past week. So one of the first things that we can do to help them make these decisions is to identify volunteer preferences. And it turns out that these preferences are predictable and stable. So in the plot on the left, each color represents a volunteer, and the size of each circle represents the number of rescues with certain set of characteristics, such as time of day, day of week, location, that volunteer has completed. And I just want to highlight that there's a lot of clustering going on by color, which suggests that these volunteers do have predictable and stable preferences. Now, this enables us to make pretty accurate predictions using simple machinery like a k-nearest neighbors approach, as shown on the right. And armed with this historical data, we want to leverage it to make better notification decisions. And this brings us to the meat of our presentation. So the first thing I'm going to do is introduce the online volunteer notification problem. It's a pretty general framework, which we think can be applied pretty broadly. But it's also a pretty challenging problem, which I hope to convince you of shortly. So we're not going to be able to come up with an optimal policy. Instead, we're going to develop online policies with constant factor guarantees. And then to evaluate those policies, we're going to compare them to some hardness results. And we're also going to test them on data from Food Rescue US. Okay, so there's our roadmap. Let's get into the model. So we've got a set of volunteers, V, a set of donation types, D, and at each time step, a donation is going to become available with a known time varying probability, such that at most one donation arrives in each period. This is a pretty traditional setup. Now our volunteers are always in the system. They're either active or inactive, and initially each volunteer is active. If an active volunteer is notified about a donation, she'll respond with her pair-specific match probability, which comes from those preferences we discussed earlier. And if an active volunteer is notified, she's going to then become inactive. And this is our way of modeling the adverse reaction that volunteers have to notifications. You can think of this inactive state as a state in which a volunteer silences notifications on her phone, and she'll turn those notifications back on after tau periods. We're not going to make many assumptions about this interactivity time distribution. We're going to leave it fairly general. And later I'll show you how our results can be parameterized by a feature of that distribution. So with this setup in mind, let's look at how our toy example would behave with this notation. So if we can notify each volunteer every 2 days, that corresponds to an interactivity time distribution that's deterministic and equal to 1. Now today we have some arrival, which occurs with a known probability. We have 2 volunteers, each with pair-specific match probabilities. We can choose to notify both of those volunteers, and as long as one of them responds positively, this donation will get completed. But now those volunteers are both inactive. If a donation arrives tomorrow, neither of them will respond to a notification, and so this donation goes unfulfilled. Obviously that's bad, because our objective is to maximize the expected number of claimed donations over our time horizon. I want to highlight that this objective function is challenging. It's nonlinear, it's submodular in the subset of volunteers that we notify in each time period. And so the underlying dynamic program is high dimensional, and in the case when the interactivity time distribution is stochastic, the state is only partially observable. In any event, this is going to be an intractable problem to solve optimally. So we're going to turn our attention to designing online policies that are simple, that can be computed in polynomial time, and that perform well compared to a benchmark. Now, before I get into talking about that benchmark, I want to highlight that we contribute to 2 main streams of literature. The first of these is on the application side, volunteer operations and staffing. And on the technical side, we contribute to work on online reusable resource allocation and profit inequalities. A lot of great work here. Happy to talk about it more offline. For now, though, let's get into discussing our benchmark. So when we think about setting a benchmark, we want to think about a clairvoyant solution that knows the arrival sequence of donations in advance, as well as the state of volunteers in each time period. In the paper, we're able to show that we can upper bound this clairvoyant solution with a linear program. So first, we upper bound our submodular objective with a piecewise linear function. And then we introduce a key constraint that places a limit on the frequency of notifications relative to this interactivity time distribution. Solving this linear program gives us a solution x star VDT, which represents the probability of notifying a volunteer conditional on a donation arriving at a particular time. Now, I want to remark that this, following this solution probabilistically does not give us a good competitive ratio. And the reason for this is that this key constraint is met only in expectation. For a particular arrival sequence, it may be violated, which means that a volunteer may be inactive at an inopportune time. So we're going to have to come up with a different approach. And we're able to do that. So first, let me highlight our high-level results. So as noted, our main theoretical results are parameterized based on the minimum discrete hazard rate of our interactivity time distribution, which is given by Q. That's a bit of a mouthful. The way you want to think about Q is that in any time period, an inactive volunteer is going to transition from inactive to active with probability at least Q. So if Q is larger, that means your volunteers are going to be frequently active. And as you can see, both our upper bound, given by this black curve, and our lower bound, given by this green curve, are increasing in Q, which should make sense. Now, our upper bound, which holds for any policy, even those that are not computable in polynomial time, is given by two instances, one of which is particularly hard when Q is small but positive, and the other which holds more generally. I'm not going to talk much about our upper bounds today. You'll have to read the paper for that. But our lower bounds come from two policies which achieve identical competitive ratios, and I'm going to talk to you in detail about one of those. The policy that I'm going to talk to you about is our sparse notification policy. Okay, our sparse notification policy starts with a feasible ex-ante solution X star, and in the paper, we talk about how to compute good ex-ante solutions, but for now, for today, you can just think of X star as the solution to that linear program benchmark I introduced earlier. Now we take this ex-ante solution and we sparsify it by solving a sequence of low-dimensional dynamic programs. Recall that one of the main challenges in this online volunteer notification problem is that our objective function depends on the joint action of all volunteers. And this represents a high-dimensional system. We're able to get around this by artificially ranking volunteers such that when multiple volunteers respond to a notification about the same donation, the highest ranked volunteer is the one that completes the rescue. This enables us to decouple the contribution of individual volunteers such that we only need to solve one low-dimensional dynamic program per volunteer. Now, to be specific, for a given volunteer, we compute this sparsification by comparing two quantities. If the reward that we get from notifying the volunteer about a particular donation at a particular time exceeds the reward that we would get from not notifying that volunteer, then we will follow our ex-ante solution when that donation arrives at that time for that volunteer. Otherwise, we will not notify her. Now, to compute these two quantities, let's consider at first this reward that we get from notification. It's got two components. The first is the reward that we get immediately from this notification. So that's the probability that this volunteer is going to be the one that completes this rescue. That happens if she's the highest ranked volunteer to respond. So to do that, she has to respond, and no higher ranked volunteer can do so. Now, for the first ranked volunteer, this is easy to compute. For later ranked volunteers, this relies on the solution of higher ranked volunteers. And so we need to compute these, the solution to these dynamic programs in sequence. Once we notify this volunteer, she becomes inactive, only to become inactive again according to this interactivity time distribution, at which point she gets a value to go. If we don't notify her, she simply gets her value to go in the subsequent period. Now, working backwards to the beginning of the time horizon, we can compute both this sparsification as well as these values to go for the top ranked volunteer. We use that solution to compute these quantities for the second ranked volunteer all the way to the last volunteer. This can be done in polynomial time. And then in the online phase, we simply probabilistically follow this sparsified solution. Okay, in our analysis, we're able to show that the individual contribution of each volunteer is lower bounded by her value to go function in time period 1, which in turn we lower bound by formulating a linear program, which we then use to find a feasible solution of its theorem. So this primal dual analysis enables us to show that the competitive ratio of our sparse notification policy is 1 minus 1 over E times 1 over 2 minus Q. Now this first term comes from upper bounding our submodular objective function with this piecewise linear benchmark. And the second term, 1 over 2 minus Q, comes from the sparsification procedure that I just discussed. In the paper, we present a second policy known as our scaled down notification policy, which starts from the same feasible ex-ante solution, but instead of sparsifying it, simply scales that solution down proportionally. Both of them achieve the same worst case guarantee, but in practice, our sparse notification policy exhibits superior performance. And that's in part why I've presented that solution today. Now again, this is the worst case guarantee. In practice, our sparse notification policy performs significantly above this worst case guarantee. And in addition, it outperforms the current practice at Food Rescue US. So to test this, we followed the current practice of notifying volunteers at most once per week, which represents an interactivity time distribution that's deterministic and equal to 7 days. And in that case, our sparse notification policy achieves about 60 to 80% of our benchmark linear program. We compare this to a heuristic that represents the current practice at FRUS. Specifically, the site director chooses a small subset of volunteers that have not been notified yet this week and notifies them. And this policy is generally, this heuristic is generally 2 or 3 times worse than our sparse notification policy. We're really encouraged by these results. We're hoping to implement a decision tool based on our policies that we will synchronize with FRUS's system. We're hoping to roll that out soon. And we think it's going to make a significant impact, both by decreasing the number of missed rescues and by reducing the amount of time that site directors spend on making notification decisions, which they can then use to recruit donors and volunteers and on other productive activities. Okay, so I've focused this whole time on our motivating application of Food Rescue US, but I want to take a moment and explain that our work can be applied much more broadly. Specifically, it can be used to improve the efficiency and engagement of notification systems in general. There's a lot of volunteer-based platforms that use nudging mechanisms. They provide a significant amount of value to society, both monetarily and towards applications that promote the social welfare. And we think that our approach can improve both the engagement and the retention of volunteers on these platforms. Going beyond volunteerism, there's a lot of marketing as well as social network applications that balance a trade-off between notifying volunteers, notifying participants and getting a benefit versus the negative impacts of notification fatigue. And these platforms would benefit from using our framework.